Hitler was driven by ideology. Napoleon was driven by genius. Stalin was driven by something colder than both. He didn't need to believe in anything. He didn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He just needed to make sure that everyone who could threaten him was dead. And he was extraordinarily good at it. By conservative estimates, Stalin was responsible for the deaths of between 6 and 20 million people during peacetime. Not in war, not from enemy action, from deliberate policy decisions made by one man sitting at a desk. Today, we're going inside the mind that made those decisions. Here's what makes Stalin psychologically unique in this series. Hitler believed his own delusions. Napoleon was undone by his own genius. Stalin had no delusions to believe in, and he was not undone by anything. He died in his bed at 74, still in power, still feared, having outlasted every rival, every ally, and every threat, real or imagined, for nearly 3 decades. The most dangerous psychological profile is not the passionate fanatic. It is the cold, methodical, paranoid survivor who treats every human relationship as a threat to be managed and every potential rival as a problem to be eliminated before it develops. That is Stalin. Start here because it was the foundation of everything. Stalin showed clear markers of paranoid personality disorder throughout his adult life. Pervasive distrust, the assumption that others were conspiring against him, hypersensitivity to perceived slights, an inability to forgive what he interpreted as disloyalty. But here's what made Stalin clinically unusual and historically catastrophic. His paranoia was functional. Most people with severe paranoid thinking become dysfunctional. Their distrust makes them unable to operate effectively in the world. Stalin's paranoia made him more effective because he was operating inside a political system where the threats were real, where people did conspire, where power was genuinely zero-sum. His paranoid threat detection, calibrated to an environment that rewarded it, became a lethal instrument of political survival. He was not wrong that people wanted to remove him. He simply eliminated them first. Always first, long before the threat had time to develop. Psychologists call this preemptive aggression, the elimination of potential threats before they materialize. Stalin turned it into state policy. Here's the foundation beneath the paranoia. Stalin's childhood in Georgia was defined by violence. His father, a cobbler and alcoholic, beat him regularly and severely. His mother, deeply religious and fiercely ambitious for her son, pushed him relentlessly toward the priesthood. 2 competing forces, unpredictable violence and controlling ambition. Psychologists studying his early life identify the psychological consequences clearly. A total inability to trust because the people who were supposed to protect him were the source of his greatest danger. A compulsive need to dominate because submission had meant pain. And a complete suppression of vulnerability because showing weakness in his household was genuinely dangerous. These patterns didn't soften when Stalin gained power. They scaled. The man who learned that vulnerability meant danger built a state in which vulnerability was systematically destroyed. Every institution that could operate independently was dismantled. Every person with genuine loyalty networks was eliminated. Every source of uncontrolled power, the military, the church, the intelligentsia, was purged, not because they were threats, but because they could become threats. And Stalin had learned very early not to wait. Here's the mechanism that most people miss entirely. Stalin was not charismatic. He was not a brilliant orator. He was not intellectually dazzling. Contemporaries consistently described him as quiet, patient, unremarkable in person, a man who listened more than he spoke, who remembered everything, who rarely revealed what he was thinking. Psychologists call this the gray blur effect, the deliberate presentation of ordinariness as a political tool. While his rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Bukhari, competed through brilliance, rhetoric, and ideology, Stalin accumulated institutional power quietly, methodically, invisibly. He controlled the appointments. He managed the files. He remembered who owed what to whom. By the time his rivals understood what had happened, he was untouchable. This is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated mechanism in this entire series. The Mask of Ordinariness is more dangerous than charisma, because charisma announces itself. You can see it coming. Ordinariness doesn't announce anything. It just accumulates power until the door is locked from the inside. Here's the layer that moves Stalin beyond psychological profile into something darker. Stalin didn't just eliminate threats. He enjoyed the process. Documented evidence from his personal annotations on execution lists, from testimonies of those who survived encounters with him, from the deliberate design of his terror apparatus, shows a consistent pattern. He prolonged suffering when it wasn't necessary. He humiliated people before destroying them. He forced associates to sign off on the deaths of their own colleagues, making them complicit, eliminating their capacity for moral objection. Psychologists identify this as sadistic personality, the derivation of genuine pleasure from the exercise of power over others, particularly through their suffering and humiliation. But Stalin's sadism was not impulsive. It was instrumental. Every act of cruelty served a dual purpose, eliminating the target and sending a message to everyone watching. The message was always the same. Nobody is safe. Nobody is beyond reach. And nobody who could threaten me will be allowed to develop long enough to try. Fear was not a byproduct of Stalin's system. It was the system. Here's the final mechanism, and the one that explains his longevity. Stalin had one psychological priority above all others, not ideology, not legacy, not even power for its own sake. Survival. Everything. Every purge, every alliance, every betrayal, every moment of apparent generosity was calculated through a single lens. Does this make me more or less likely to survive? Psychologists call this hypervigilant self-preservation, a state of continuous threat assessment that never relaxes, never trusts, never allows the guard to drop. It meant he could be warm when warmth was useful, brutal when brutality was required, patient for years before acting, decisive in a single moment. He had no ideology to contradict him, no genius to betray him, no loyalty to anyone that could be exploited. He was psychologically self-contained in a way that made him almost impossible to predict, and therefore impossible to outmaneuver. The great irony of Stalin's psychology is this. The abuse that created his inability to trust made him the most politically durable leader of the 20th century. His damage was his armor. So here's what Stalin's psychological profile tells us. Not that he was uniquely evil in some way that places him beyond understanding, but that he represents the most replicable psychological type in this series. Hitler required a specific ideology in a specific historical moment. Napoleon required extraordinary talent. Stalin required nothing except the psychological architecture of a traumatized child who learned that the only safety was total control and the patience to build it one eliminated threat at a time. That architecture doesn't require genius. It doesn't require ideology. It doesn't require a specific historical crisis. It only requires power and a person who treats every human relationship as either a tool or a threat. Those people exist in every era, in every institution, at every scale. The question is never whether they exist. The question is whether the systems around them are strong enough to stop them before the door locks from the inside.